Hello, welcome back to Water Quality in the Pacific Northwest. Uh, we're going to start our third major unit today. We're going to talk about surface water quality, and in this discussion, we'll be specifically talking about certain pollutants and the type of measurements we make to determine surface water quality. If you take a look at what we are going to try and cover in this unit, this is a pretty big unit. We're going to talk about nutrients in water, sediments, erosion on the land, pathogens and invasive species, toxic metals and toxic chemicals, high temperatures, which impacts surface water quality, specific water quality measurements, the biology of stagnant surface water bodies, the biology of free-flowing waters, and we'll take a look at a few case studies. So Lecture 10 is our first lecture in this section, and we're going to specifically zero in on nutrients or nutrient pollution. Nutrient pollution is a form of water pollution that refers to contamination by excessive nutrients. Nutrient pollution is a primary cause of eutrophication of surface water bodies. We'll talk specifically about eutrophication in a unit down the road in this section of the course. So we're going to zero in on nutrient pollution today. And when we talk about nutrient pollution, there are lots of different nutrients that can pollute water, but we're really interested in two specific nutrients that are very biologically active in waters. So in excessive quantities, the nutrients nitrogen and phosphorus can stimulate the growth of algae in surface waters and cause all kinds of problems with water quality and all kinds of problems for aquatic organisms that live within these water bodies. Here's an aerial photo of where we have algae growth, basically caused by excessive nutrients, nitrogen, and or phosphorus. Nutrient pollution is not something that's really easy to take care of because there are a lot of sources of nutrient pollution. For instance, all kinds of human activities can put nutrients in the water. Many sources of nutrient pollution, including surface runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus from farms, surface runoff of animal waste from farms and in other communities, and even septic tank leakage can be a problem. For instance, we'll take a picture of a landscape. Here we have a cattle farm, and we have cattle standing in the water. Well, cattle, when they defecate, create manure, and that manure is laden with nitrogen and phosphorus. That's not good. One farm like this in a watershed, maybe not too bad, but when you have dozens and dozens and dozens of farms, the potential for nutrient pollution increases, and it puts a lot of stress on our surface water bodies. There are many sources of nutrient pollution. We'll go back and talk about these in the lecture today. Probably one of the most prominent that we think about in the United States are feedlots, particularly feedlots where we have a lot of animals. We call feedlots where we concentrate animals together CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations. Also, when we burn crops on farms and stuff like that, we put nitrogen in the atmosphere, into the system, phosphorus into the system, and that can actually lead to nutrient pollution. About 40% of all the beef we raise in the United States is raised in confined animal feeding operations. Now, this may be an efficient way to produce meat products, but it greatly concentrates animal waste. And if that animal waste is not handled properly, that waste can leak into the environment, particularly our surface waters. We have areas of the United States and areas of the developed and developing world where we have huge operations of confined animal feeding operations. For instance, here's a picture where you just have one confined animal feeding operation after another. Any leakage from that operation, any nitrogen or phosphorus that comes off the surface of that land can end up in surface water and cause nutrient pollution. Lots of things cause nutrient pollution. If you take a look at the landscape, just taking a look at some of these activities, we've got cows here, nitrogen and phosphorus can run off the land. We've got crops, over fertilization or improper fertilization can put nutrients in the soil, which eventually end up in a surface body of water. We have septic systems, we have homes, we have lawns, we have gardens. Any nitrogen or phosphorus that runs off that land can adversely impact surface water quality. Power plants, we have some nitrogen emissions from certain types of power plants. Chemical storage, things like that. Any nitrogen or phosphorus that leaks from that can end up in the water. So there's all sorts of things that can cause nutrient pollution. So if too many nutrients run off the land and end up in surface water, we get excessive levels of nutrients, and the negative impact of excessive levels of nutrients, we have ecological effects, we have community effects, we have all sorts of effects. So let's take a look at ecological effects. We put too much nitrogen or phosphorus in the environment that ends up in the water. That may change food webs in the water systems. If you put too much nitrogen and phosphorus in a surface body of water, that will cause algae growth on the surface. That algae growth on the surface of the water limits light penetration into the deeper waters, and that interferes with the aquatic organisms that live in the ecosystem. You have community effects. You start messing with nutrient concentrations in water, and you change the composition of aquatic species in that water. Usually you don't change them for the better. Usually you change the aquatic species composition for the worse. We have population effects, excess growth of algae. We get algae blooms. It's something that's not very inviting. We have a picture here of showing eutrophication of a surface river, and you've got people that are trying to row their boat, and they don't see any crystal clear water. They're just flowing in a sea of algae. Other adverse impacts. Excessive levels of nutrients potentially lead to negative impacts on biodiversity. You've got excess algae blooms, which I mentioned before. Excess algae blooms can cause biodiversity loss. And you end up with river systems. They're just not very healthy. Here's a river that's been eutrophied, excess algae on the surface. Not much light can penetrate through the surface water there, so the aquatic system below the surface is not very vibrant. So if we just move on from talking about ecological effects, we can have some negative impacts on human health also. Excess nitrates, or nitrogen that moves into surface waters, can result in excessive nitrate levels in drinking water. High levels of nitrate in drinking water can be toxic to infants, children less than 6 months old. As a matter of fact, the nitrogen is changed to nitrite, from nitrate to nitrite. The nitrite gets into a baby's blood system, and the nitrite reacts with hemoglobin, which is our blood, and it robs the blood of oxygen, and you end up with a symptom called blue baby, where it's a facial symptom on a child, a young child, where below the nose and around the mouth, the child takes on a bluish tinge, and that's simply as a result of not enough oxygen in the blood system. You end up with disinfection byproducts. You have all sorts of problems. The Environmental Protection Agency considers the following to be large-scale problems associated with too much nitrogen in the environment. We call it nutrient pollution. One of the major problems is eutrophication of surface waters. Again, we will talk about eutrophication of rivers a little bit later in this unit. You get down to it, put your hands in the water and you got so much algae on top, you're just scooping this algae up. And this algae, under normal situations, algae is limited by the lack of nutrients in water. You put too many nutrients in the water, you get this bloom. But this algae basically prevents sunlight from penetrating deep in the water and really messes with aquatic ecosystems. In addition to eutrophication, sometimes the algae blooms can be toxic. That's a concern. Another type of nutrient pollution we call hypoxia. That occurs in salt water off the coasts of many continents. It's a result of nutrients moving down rivers, often from farmland and urbanscapes, and we get the same type of lack of oxygen in coastal seawater. We call that hypoxia. Acid rainfall. One of the major contributors to acid rainfall is nitrogen oxides, NOx's. You put them up in the atmosphere, they react with precipitation, fall to the earth as nitrogen or nitrogen oxide, nitric acid, and that's one of the things that causes the acidification of many of our rivers, can adversely impact forest ecosystems, can even adversely impact building materials. So acid rainfall is also another form of nutrient pollution. We see some of the problems with too much nitrogen, even in ecosystems that we considered fairly natural. We see in some of our forest ecosystems that so much nitrogen is in these systems from air pollution today that the trees grow very well in the summer, but they keep on having plenty of nitrogen, so they stop growing. They don't stop growing going into the fall, so they don't turn dormant. And then when the weather gets really cold, this adversely impacts the survival of these trees. So that's another issue today. Another issue that can be tied to nutrient pollution would be climate change. Nitrogen oxides are a greenhouse gas. They lead to climate change, and as some people call it today, global warming. We keep on going down the list. Nutrient pollution has far-reaching effects. Ocean acidification. We're going to talk about the acidification of oceans in a separate lecture later in this course. So that is a problem that is associated with nutrient pollution. So where does this nitrogen come from? Let's look at some of the potential sources. We've always had sources of nitrogen in the environment. Humans have just made these sources bigger and to also have a bigger impact. So some of these sources have greatly increased the quantity of nitrogen in the biosphere. For instance, the manufacture and use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, and even the use of organic nitrogen fertilizers put nitrogen into the environment. We manufacture large quantities of nitrogen fertilizers because that's how we feed 7 billion people on this planet. Without synthetic fertilizers, we could probably only feed 2 billion people. But the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers have allowed us to expand the food supply for an additional 5 billion people. Even our organic fertilizers, even fertilizers from manure from animals, that boosts the amount of nitrogen in the environment. It makes the land more productive, but if the nitrogen moves off that land into the waters, we end up with surface water pollution. In addition to synthetic nitrogen fertilizers, we have other sources of nitrogen. Nitrogen fixation, which is the capture of nitrogen from the atmosphere into nitrogen in plants that eventually ends up in soil by certain organisms that we call nitrogen-fixing organisms, particularly nitrogen fixers associated with legume plants. As the acreage of legumes has greatly expanded across the planet, the quantity of nitrogen fixed by these legumes or the microbes that live in association with the legumes has greatly expanded. And nitrogen-fixing legumes are things like alfalfa and clovers and soybeans, a major world crop, dry beans, uh, lots and lots of different legumes that collectively have millions of acres of farmland. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we have about 10 million acres of farmland that is devoted to legume production. Far more than the amount of legumes that were on the land in the Pacific Northwest prior to human cultivation of land. We burn fossil fuels. That puts nitrogen in the atmosphere. That creates a major source of nitrogen that eventually moves down into our soils, can run off our soils into our water, or can just directly fall as precipitation over our oceans and over our lands. So the quantity of nitrogen in the atmosphere and in our systems has greatly increased. Additional sources of nitrogen include animal production. We have greatly increased the amount of animals we grow on this planet, animals for human consumption. I've seen a number, something like 18 to 20 billion animals are grown primarily for human consumption. That's almost 3 times the human population as it is. And especially when animal production is concentrated into specialized feeding units such as CAFOs. So nitrogen is not the only source of nutrient pollution of waters. The other source is phosphorus. As with nitrogen, the sources and quantity of phosphorus that we see associated with human use of land has greatly increased, and as a result, greatly increased the amount of reactive phosphorus in the biosphere. Some of this is from excess phosphorus fertilizer use. Manure, animal waste contains quite a bit of phosphorus. We apply the manure to agricultural land, even in organic conditions, and if the phosphorus from the manure moves off the field, it enters the water body and causes problems in water quality. In addition to just agriculture, anytime we get soil erosion from different types of industries, that puts phosphorus in the water. Wastewater treatment plants, which will be the last unit that we talk about in this course, humans use a lot of phosphorus in everyday life. That includes our laundry detergents contain phosphorus. If we have wastewater treatment plants in our local communities that don't remove the phosphorus, we're directly putting biologically active phosphorus in the water system that will eventually create nutrient pollution. Our major source of phosphorus in water happens to be erosion of soils from lands. When we apply phosphorus to soils, the phosphorus adheres to the soil particles. Phosphorus does not leach through soils. You put it in the soil and it adheres to soil particles. As long as you keep those soil particles on the field, you don't have phosphorus nutrient problems in waters. However, if some of this soil runs off through the process of erosion, these soil particles run off and enter in surface bodies of water. That's where we have problems. So if we take a look at sources of phosphorus, these sources have greatly increased in quantity. We have industrial plants that use phosphates. Any phosphorus that's emitted from the plant may end up in surface water. We have phosphorus mining operations. We have large phosphorus mines worldwide. In the United States, we have large phosphorus mines in Florida, in western Wyoming, in southeastern Idaho, in Tennessee. Here's a look at a phosphorus mining operation in Florida. A lot of water associated. Remember, Florida is a pretty wet state. It gets well over 40 inches of annual precipitation. Any exposed geologic material that has phosphate in it can wash off into the surface body of water and create nutrient pollution. So land use is really a primary issue when we talk about nutrient pollution. Land use is the primary source of nutrient pollution in specific watersheds. If you take a look at land use in specific watersheds, it's easy to identify the potential sources of nutrient pollution. We have two types of nutrient pollution. We have both what we call point and non-point pollution sources. Point sources are pollutants that we can identify exactly where they come from. For instance, if we have an industrial plant, and from that industrial plant we have a pipe that carries the waste, and that pipe goes directly into a river, we call that a point source of pollution. If we take a water sample out of a river and we see nitrates in it, we know the nitrates came from the surrounding land, but we can't pinpoint the exact location of that nitrogen. So we call that non-point pollution. We've been pretty successful at controlling point source pollution, but we have been very unsuccessful at dealing with non-point source pollution. That's one of our big challenges today. Again, if we take a look at the sources of nutrients, we look at land use. In agriculture, definitely animal production is a major source of nutrient pollution, both nitrogen and phosphorus. We're producing more and more animals all the time, and that waste associated with the animals is significant. It's estimated that a cow in southern Idaho, one cow will produce 6 times as much waste as an average human being. So if the state of Idaho has a population of 1.8 million people, in south central Idaho we have 600,000 dairy cows. We take 600,000 dairy cows, and the equivalent waste amount is 6 times what an average human is. We take 600,000 times 6, that's 3.6 million. So the dairy cows in Idaho produce the amount of waste equivalent to 3.6 million human beings, which is more than double the state's population. We get nutrients leaving cropland because we apply both nitrogen and phosphorus to make our crops yield well. As long as we keep the nutrients on the land, they don't leak off the land, and those nutrients end up in the crops that we eat, we're okay. But fertilizer use efficiency isn't that what I would call effective. I mean, probably only about 60% of the nutrients we apply to the land actually ends up in the crop. The other 40% either stays in the soil or moves from the soil to a water source. Agriculture is not the only culprit. If we move to the urban-suburban environment, a lot of our land in urban areas is paved, and we move the water from the paved land through stormwater runoff. And any nutrients that end up on our paved land wash off when it rains, and the stormwater runoff from roads and parking lots directly enters surface bodies of water and can cause nutrient pollution. Within our urban environment, if you own a home or live in an apartment complex where they fertilize the lawns, if the nitrogen and phosphorus that's put on the lawns doesn't stay in the soil or in the lawns, it runs off and eventually ends up in our rivers. Same thing with gardens. If you're a gardener, excess nutrients will end up in the river. It doesn't matter if you use a synthetic fertilizer that's manufactured or an organic fertilizer. If it runs off the land, it will cause nutrient pollution to the water. Here's an example of a stormwater drain draining away water from the urban environment, and basically anything that's on the land, on those concrete pads. That could be nitrogen, could be phosphorus, could be many things, but that becomes part of stormwater, and that is a significant source of nutrient pollution. Another example of stormwater, this is a better example of it. You can see the cloudy water. That means we've lost some soil, and that's come down the storm drain and into the river body, and that cloudy is soil sediments. And remember, phosphorus particles are attached to soil particles, so we're putting phosphorus in the river, and that's where we end up with nutrient pollution. We stay with land use. If we take a look at the urban-suburban use, we have municipal wastewater treatment plants. If they don't effectively remove the inorganic nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, we end up with nutrient pollution of waters. Our motor vehicles, they emit some nitrogen. When it rains, that nitrogen that's left on our paved surfaces wash off as stormwater and enter the surface body of water. Also, when we talk about industry, industry is not immune to causing surface pollution. Air pollution. Nitrogen is a component of air pollution. Electrical power plant emissions put some nitrogen in the environment. And any wastewater discharges are also problems. So there's lots of sources of nutrients that cause pollution in bodies of water. Our problem is it's very hard to control those emissions. We can lower point source nitrogen and phosphorus pollutants because we can identify the source and we can put effective controls. But for the nitrogen and phosphorus that enter bodies of water that are non-point sources, they're small distributed sources, they're very hard to control. In the United States, agricultural non-point source pollution is the largest source of water quality impairment in the United States. It's believed to be the largest source of water quality impairment, nutrient pollution, in 45 of our 50 states. Right now, non-point source pollution is not subject to discharge permits under the Clean Water Act. If it were, it would be very hard to define and control. So we just haven't made much progress there. Point source discharges are not the major source of nutrient pollution. It's the non-point sources, the dispersed sources. They're our problem. So we're doing a pretty good job at taking care of point source discharges of nitrogen and phosphorus to comply with nutrient effluent limitations. One type of way we deal with nutrient pollution is through a process that began in the late 80s in the United States. It's a process where we look at TMDLs. TMDLs is an acronym for the total maximum daily load of a particular pollutant. TMDLs are part of a regulatory program to limit nutrient pollution. Now, basically what a TMDL is a TMDL looks at a specific body of water, and scientists determine how much of a particular nutrient can be in that surface body of water, and the beneficial uses of that body of water are still being met. So TMDLs prescribe the maximum amount of a pollutant that a body of water can receive while still meeting the Clean Water Act quality standards. You can develop a TMDL for most surface bodies of water. We have TMDLs for nitrogen, limits of nitrogen that can be in the water. For phosphorus, we can develop a TMDL for pesticides in water. We can develop a TMDL for heavy metal concentrations. We can develop a TMDL for sediments, how much suspended sediment the water body can have and still meet its beneficial use, a TMDL for temperature, and TMDLs for other pollutants as they're identified. States are required to assess all their surface bodies of water and determine if there is a pollutant that causes that water body not to meet its designated beneficial uses. So states are required to generate a TMDL report for each body of water that is impaired by pollutants. This is mandated by Section 303 of the Clean Water Act. So basically what a TMDL is, it's a pollution budget. A body of water can have a TMDL. Here's a picture of an example of a surface body of water that does not have enough dissolved oxygen. The net result is a fish kill. The the fish suffocated because they did not have enough oxygen. So the most common TMDLs are developed for sediment because by far that's the biggest surface water quality problem we have. However, about 20% of all the TMDLs are related to nutrients, nitrogen and or phosphorus. So once a designated body of water comes, scientists figure out what pollutant is causing that water body not to meet its most beneficial use. Beneficial uses could be drinking water, it could be fish for fish spawning, it could be for irrigation water, it could be for lots of different things. Each body of water has at least one designated beneficial use. So if we have a TMDL for a surface body of water, we need solutions to reduce pollution levels. Nutrient remediation is a form of environmental remediation, but basically right now we're only addressing nitrogen and phosphorus, the two most biologically active nutrients. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep nitrogen and phosphorus values in surface bodies of water as low as possible. We've done the easy stuff. We've taken care of point sources. We've taken care of points from factories and other things where we know nitrogen and phosphorus are coming from, and we've limited those industries to the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that can be disposed of in water bodies. Our problem is the dispersed nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus from farmland. We know that we're getting nitrogen from farmland, but we can't identify which farmland is putting the most nitrogen and phosphorus in the environment. That's a challenge. So we have to come up with innovative nutrient technologies, tricks to try and reduce nutrient concentrations going into surface bodies of water. We can use things like biofilters. Biofiltration, we use living materials to capture and biologically degrade or utilize pollutants. And I'll show you a few examples of them a little bit later. So we have a lot of different things we can do. We can use biofilters to reduce nutrients from municipal sewage plants, from agricultural fertilizers, from livestock waste, from stormwater drainage, and even from aquaculture, the agricultural practice of growing trout in place. Examples of biofilters include putting green belts around water bodies, creating natural wetlands where you have plants that suck up excess nitrogen and phosphorus, actually constructing wetlands to basically be biofilters. So examples of biofilters would include things like riparian areas or treatment ponds. These biofilters are built to capture human discharges such as wastewater, stormwater runoff, partially treated sewage, and we'll talk about that when we talk about wastewater management right at the end of the course. So we're really interested in nutrient bioextraction from water. It basically is bioremediation involving cultured plants and animals. Here's an example of bioextraction. On the coast in northwestern Washington, we are now growing shellfish and seaweed in coastal areas along the ocean, and we're using the shellfish and the seaweed to suck up excess nitrogen and phosphorus from our natural water bodies to reduce the threat of eutrophication in water bodies. On land, the area around water, we don't plant the crops, so any nutrients moving off these fields would be captured by the plants growing in this buffer strip. Is this a good buffer strip? No, probably not. It's not wide enough. The only reason a buffer strip is here is because the land isn't flat enough to farm right there. But we use technologies where we build better buffer strips, better filter strips. Here's some relatively flat farmland where we've set aside a grassy area around the waterway so that any nutrients moving off the farmland have a good chance to be sucked up by the roots of the grasses in the filter strip. If you take a look at a landscape in a watershed, there are lots of things we can do. Planting green areas along riparian areas or along water bodies to prevent the movement of nitrogen and phosphorus into these water bodies. Let's use that nitrogen and phosphorus to grow plants along those water bodies, natural plants that suck up those nutrients and prevent them from getting in the water bodies. So we have nutrient standards that have been developed and criteria in surface waters that were developed and mandated by the 1972 Clean Water Act. In 1978, the EPA developed a wastewater management regulation to start addressing the nitrogen pollution problem. By 1998, EPA had published a national nutrient strategy focusing on developing criteria for reducing nitrogen pollution in water. And from 2000 to 2010, at the federal level, criteria were published for basically nitrogen pollution in rivers and streams, and lakes and reservoirs, in estuaries and wetlands. So a lot of this work had been done. The states are behind. By 1998, a majority of states still had not developed numeric nutrient criteria, nitrogen and phosphorus criteria. By 2015, we still had 10 states that were woefully behind in the development of this criteria. It's a work in progress. One of the problems is it's very expensive and it's very difficult to do. So the interest in nutrient removal and achieving regional TMDLs led to the development of another concept, which we call nutrient trading. Nutrient trading is a new concept, and it's a type of water quality trading. That is, it's a model-based policy instrument used to improve or maintain water quality. And basically it gives communities the right to buy and trade pollution credits. It's kind of a new concept. There's a lot of interest in this. We have some nutrient pollution trading in the lower Boise Valley. It's a tool that can be used, has a lot of positive things. Nutrient trading involves a voluntary exchange of pollution reduction credits. Trading from sources with low costs of pollution control to those with high costs of pollution control. So communities can trade pollution limits with each other just so that the whole watershed achieves an overall reduction in pollution. There are a lot of people that are interested in funding water trading or pollution trading credits. Beneficiaries of watershed protection are interested in buying and trading credits. Polluter may buy and trade credits to compensate for some of their impacts that they create. And public good payers, i.e. NGOs, they buy pieces of land, they rent pieces of land, they implement best management practices to reduce nutrient pollution. Nutrient source apportionment, or what we call NSA, is used to estimate the nutrient load from various sectors entering the water body. There's a couple ways of doing this. We can use modeling. Basically, we can use a load-oriented approach, which apportions origin based on stream monitoring data. For instance, if we're in a watershed and we have a TMDL for nitrogen of 0.3 parts per million, that's what we want. But the actual amount of nitrogen in the water is 3 parts per million. That means we need to reduce the nitrogen content by 2.7 parts per million. We need to take a look at the landscape and determine where those nutrients are coming from and apportion to different landowners their reduction criteria that they must meet. It's pretty difficult to do. So that's our load-oriented approach. And then we have a source-oriented approach where amounts of diffuse emissions are calculated using models, and again, things are apportioned. This is pretty difficult to do. We're kind of in our infancy of actually establishing pollution trading and criteria to reduce nutrient concentrations in water bodies and watersheds. It's pretty complex. It's pretty complicated. You have to get all the players in the watershed on board. This includes the general public, the landowners, the NGOs, municipalities, the whole bit. It's a pretty complicated process. To date, we are making progress, although the progress is not very fast because it's a very complicated system. We'll continue to talk about some aspects of nutrient pollution in this large unit as we go through eutrophication and some other things that are very much related to nitrogen and phosphorus. Thank you for your attention. Phosphorus and heavy metals, or just for nitrogen, or just for sediments. Basically, what happens is scientists have to take a look at what pollutants are impairing that body of water from meeting its designated beneficial use. Probably the most common TMDL that we have developed in the country is for sediment. Sediments seem to be the TMDL which creates most havoc to water quality And when we talk about sediments, we're again talking about phosphates, because phosphorus is attached to sediments, and if there's too many sediments going into the water, we probably have too high of levels of phosphorus. We even have TMDLs for dissolved oxygen content. We need oxygen in the water for fish survival.